Settle in and let go. There's nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to hold on to. Slowly, we'll wander back to a great stone city, rising quietly from the African earth. If these help you sleep, subscribe. I post a new one every night. The granite is warm beneath the hand, not the warmth of direct sunlight. The sun has moved past its peak, and the air along the base of the wall carries the cooler suggestion of late afternoon, but the deeper, slower warmth of stone that has been absorbing heat across the full length of a long day and is now releasing it quietly back into the dusk. The individual blocks are rough-grained at the surface, slightly crystalline to the touch, each one a shade of gray that shifts toward gold at the edges where the light still catches it. And between one block and the next, between every course stacked upon every course for the full 11 meters rising above, there is no mortar, no filler, no adhesive of any kind. The courses hold because the stone was cut and shaped with enough precision that the weight of each block against the ones beneath it is sufficient. That precision, repeated across an estimated 900,000 individual granite blocks, produced a wall that has now stood without mortar for more than 700 years. The wall being described is the outer face of the great enclosure, the largest single stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Its circumference runs to approximately 250 meters. At its base, the wall measures as much as 5 meters thick, wide enough that 2 people could walk abreast along its top. It rises in some places to 11 meters, well above the canopy of any tree growing in the valley around it. The blocks from which it was assembled were not carried vast distances. The granite underfoot throughout this part of the Zimbabwe plateau weathers in a particular way. It exfoliates, splitting along natural internal fault lines into roughly rectangular slabs when the rock surface expands and contracts with the cycling heat and cold of this elevated grassland. The kopjes, the rounded granite outcroppings that rise from the plateau in every direction, were the quarry. The stone was there, and it already held something close to the form required. Placing a hand flat against the base of the outer wall and holding it there for a moment, the grain of the stone settles against the skin. There is no gap at this joint wide enough to admit a finger. The block above rests exactly as it should on the block below, and the block below has been exactly where it is long enough that the surrounding stone has taken a faint patina from the seasons, from the rain that runs down the outer face in the wet season, from the moss that has grown and died and grown again in the wetter centuries since this structure was raised. The base of the wall is slightly wider than its upper courses, a deliberate batter, a gentle inward lean that distributes the load and contributes to the wall's resistance to lateral pressure. That design choice is embedded here in the stone, without a word written about it, without a document filed describing it, but present in the form of the structure itself, which has been demonstrating its effectiveness continuously since approximately the 13th century. The great enclosure is not the only stone structure on this site. It is the largest and the most refined of a complex of buildings and enclosures that extends across the valley floor and climbs the surrounding hillsides in a graduated sequence of construction quality and social meaning. But standing at its base in the cooling of the afternoon, with the wall rising to its full height and the chevron patterning beginning somewhere above, the eye has to travel upward to find it. The scale of this specific structure is what first establishes that the city being described was built over a sustained period of time by a population that had accumulated both the labor capacity and the architectural knowledge to produce something on this order. Near the top of the outer wall, visible from some distance across the valley floor, a band of chevron patterning runs along the upper course of the exterior face. Each block in this section has been set at a deliberate diagonal, turned so that its corner projects slightly outward from the flat plane of the wall, and the alternation of diagonals produces a continuous zigzag line, sharp, rhythmic, unhurried, that moves along the upper perimeter of the structure as a visible formal element. This was not a structural requirement. The wall stands perfectly well without it. It is a decorative choice, a decision to mark the upper edge of the building's exterior face with a pattern that would be legible from the fields and paths below, something that declared the presence of the enclosure to anyone moving through the valley long before they reached its entrance. The chevron band was a designed visual claim on the landscape. Standing at the base now and tilting back to look upward, the scale of the patterning resolves itself. The individual blocks in the chevron section are no larger than those in the plain courses below them. The difference is simply the angle at which they were laid, the extra care required to set a diagonal block in exact alignment with the ones adjacent to it on either side, so that the zigzag line reads as continuous rather than broken. Across a circumference of 250 meters, that care was sustained. The band does not break. It does not lose its regularity where the wall curves. The work was done with consistency around the full perimeter, which means the workers laying this course understood the overall form they were producing and held it in mind across the full length of their task. The entrance passage into the great enclosure runs between two walls, the outer wall and a parallel inner wall, and the corridor formed between them is narrow enough that people moving through it would have done so in single file, or very nearly. The inner wall is not as tall as the outer, but it is built to the same standard, the same dry stone technique, the same careful interlocking of courses without mortar. Walking the length of this passage at dusk, the sky above is a strip between the two wall tops, narrowed to a band of light, the stone on either side rising close enough to brush with extended arms. The passage has been interpreted as a controlling approach, a formal architectural entry that regulated movement, that brought visitors and residents through a defined corridor before they emerged into the enclosure's interior. The experience of moving through it is not accidental. It was designed into the building. Inside the great enclosure, the space is larger than the outer wall suggests from the valley floor. The internal area is not empty. It contains smaller stone structures, passages between secondary walls, enclosures within the enclosure. But the central space holds enough room that the mind expands slightly in arriving there from the narrow passage. And near the far end of the interior, solid and immobile, rising to approximately 9 meters and measuring roughly 5 meters at its base, stands the conical tower. It has no door, it has no window, it has no staircase, no interior chamber, no opening of any kind visible on its exterior surface. The tower is solid throughout its full height, filled entirely with rubble and compacted earth, and its exterior is faced with the same dry stone construction as the walls surrounding it, the same careful courses, the same precision in the fitting of granite blocks without mortar. It tapers as it rises, its circular base narrowing gradually to a rounded peak, so that its profile from any point in the enclosure is that of a smooth, blunt cone. In the morning, when the light enters the enclosure from the east, the rounded top of the tower catches the sun before the courtyard below it, and the peak holds a warmth the rest of the enclosure has not yet received. The tower has been studied by every archaeologist and scholar who has worked seriously at this site. It has produced no consensus beyond the agreement that its solid construction was deliberate and its sealed form was designed from the outset. This is not a tower whose interior was filled in after the fact, not a structure from which a staircase or chamber was removed. It was built solid. The most widely accepted interpretation among contemporary scholars connects the tower's form to Shona ceremonial and political symbolism associated with royal authority over agricultural production, a granary form abstracted into stone, a permanent declaration of the ruler's role as the source of abundance. That interpretation rests on the tower's visual and contextual relationship to the enclosure around it, and on the comparisons available from later Shona architectural and symbolic traditions. What the tower says of itself is nothing. Its surface is closed. Its interior is not accessible. Standing near the base of the conical tower in the enclosure's interior, the surrounding walls reduce the visible horizon to a frame of stone and sky. The outer wall's chevron band is visible from here, running along the upper perimeter. The narrow inner wall parallel to the outer wall defines the corridor to the east. The secondary enclosures and passages opening to the north and south suggest a more complex internal arrangement than the open central courtyard first implies. The tower itself, at the south end of the interior space, fills its portion of the frame with a presence that is disproportionate to its physical dimensions. It is not the tallest element in the enclosure, but it is the most concentrated. Its surface, close up, shows the same precision of fitting as the outer walls. Individual blocks were selected and positioned with sufficient care that the curved profile of the tower's exterior presents a coherent form rather than the lumpy, irregular outline a cruder approach to circular construction would have produced. The stone for the tower came from the same source as the stone for everything else here, the kopjes of the Zimbabwe plateau, those rounded outcroppings of migmatitic granite that stud the elevated grassland in every direction, heated and cooled across the seasons and split along their natural fault lines into slabs that the hands of the builders could manage, could carry, could fit. No heavy cutting tools were required to produce blocks of approximate rectangularity from this material. The heating and cooling cycle of the plateau climate did much of that work over the long geological preparation of the site. What the builders brought was the knowledge of how to select, carry, and stack the slabs so that their natural variation in size was accommodated in the coursework, so that the courses remained level across long horizontal runs, so that the facing of the wall produced a plane of stone that felt finished rather than approximate. That knowledge was not acquired quickly. The stone construction at Great Zimbabwe represents generations of accumulated technique, builders who were trained by builders who had themselves been trained, a craft tradition with its own standards and its own methods of assessment, capable of producing the great enclosure's outer wall and the conical tower and the intricate passage system of the interior as the visible output of something deeper than individual skill. The wall at the base of which a hand rests, flat against the dry stone in the late afternoon warmth, is the physical record of that accumulation. Stepping back from the base of the outer wall and walking a short distance across the valley floor, the full height of the great enclosure becomes available to view at once. From here, the chevron band along the upper exterior is clearly legible, a rhythmic line against the sky. The wall beneath it is unornamented, its courses running in horizontal bands that give the structure its sense of composed weight. The wall does not look improvised. It does not look approximate. It looks like the result of a long, patient intention carried through to completion by people who knew exactly what they were building. The great enclosure stands roughly at the center of the low valley between the surrounding hillsides, and to the east, rising approximately 80 meters above the valley floor, on a formation of natural granite boulders, the hill complex occupies the summit of the kopje, The site takes its form around the hill complex, also called the Acropolis, uses the natural granite boulders of the Kopje as the primary structural material for its own enclosures and passages. Walls are built between boulders, across boulders, using the rock itself as anchor and foundation. From the valley floor, the summit is not easily readable in detail. What is visible is the irregular silhouette of granite rising above the valley, with stone walls appearing between the boulder masses, and at the very top, on the flattened platforms and rocky shelves of the summit, the positions where carved soapstone columns once stood. Those columns held the Zimbabwe bird sculptures, soapstone carvings of a bird with a distinctive profile, a long neck, upright posture, small carved details at the wings and tail, each one sitting atop a stone pillar on the summit of the hill complex. The birds were recovered in excavations from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, removed from the site, as the majority of significant portable objects from this site were removed during that period, and they have since passed through various collections and controversies. 8 such sculptures are known. Their original positions on the summit columns placed them above the full sweep of the valley below, visible in silhouette against the sky from the valley floor, the carved forms of the birds holding the summit's highest points against whatever light was moving across the plateau at any given hour. The hill complex was the site's primary royal and ceremonial space, and the archaeological evidence recovered from its excavated deposits, glass beads of Indian Ocean origin, gold objects, the remains of the soapstone columns, indicates that the objects associated with the highest social and political levels of the city's organization were concentrated here. Glass beads traveled from the coast through trade networks that connected this plateau to the Indian Ocean world. They arrived at the hill complex as evidence of the city's participation in a much wider economic system, but they came to rest here, at this summit, in the possession of whoever occupied this position at the apex of the city's social hierarchy. From the summit of the hill complex, looking south and west across the valley floor, the extent of the valley ruins becomes clear in a way that is not available from any point within them. The ruins extend across approximately 720 hectares in total, a vast spreading fabric of stone enclosures, walls of varying height and finish, passages and courtyards, middens and house platforms, covering the valley floor and climbing the lower hillsides in a graduated sequence that becomes less refined in construction quality the further it extends from the great enclosure at its center. This variation was not accidental. The quality of a stone enclosure in the valley ruins, the precision of its coursework, the height of its walls, the fineness of the fitting, functioned as a visible marker of the status of whoever occupied it, a social system made legible in architecture. The finest valley ruins enclosures, those closest to the great enclosure, are built to a standard approaching the outer wall itself. Careful courses, well-fitted blocks, walls of sufficient height to create genuine enclosed spaces with their own interior logic. Moving outward from the great enclosure, the enclosures become progressively less refined. Walls are shorter, the fitting is less precise, the courses are less regular. At the outer edge of the 720 hectares, the stone walls thin, and in places have been almost entirely absorbed by the grass and the soil, their remnant outlines visible mainly because of the slight changes in vegetation that mark a buried stone foundation. The city dissolved at its edges into the plateau, the built fabric of the urban settlement, giving way gradually to the fields and pastures that sustained it. Standing inside one of the mid-range valley ruins enclosures in the late afternoon, the walls at head height, around a small courtyard, the doorway opening in the direction of the great enclosure's outer wall, visible in the middle distance. The scale of the construction becomes domestic. These enclosures were lived in. The stone walls define the space of daily life. Sleeping, eating, the storage of goods, the keeping of animals, the activities of a household operating within the social structure of a complex urban settlement. The pole and dhaka houses that stood inside these stone enclosures have not survived. Their structural materials, wooden poles, the packed earthen mixture called dhaka, do not persist above ground across the centuries. The stone has persisted. But the post holes left in the earth where the poles stood, the midden deposits accumulated at the enclosure edges, the pottery sherds in the stratified deposits, indicate a specific domestic life conducted within these stone-defined spaces, a life that was fully ordinary to those who lived it. The doorways of the valley ruins enclosures are in many cases still standing. The lintels are gone in most of them, wooden elements that did not last, but the stone jambs on either side of a typical valley ruins doorway remain where they were built, and the opening they defined is still proportioned for a person walking through, still oriented toward whatever the enclosure's arrangement required. A doorway in a stone wall, standing open after 7 centuries, is a specific kind of object. It has a before and an after, the space outside the wall and the space inside it, and the transition between them was designed and placed by someone who decided where the threshold should be and how wide it should be and in which direction it should face. Those decisions are still present in the standing stone. The valley ruins extend across the valley floor in every direction from the great enclosure, and the number of individual enclosures within the 720-hectare total is substantial enough that counting them from above on any map or aerial photograph of the site produces an immediate impression of density. This was not a ceremonial center with a small permanent population gathered around a large monument. The scale of the built environment, the distribution of the enclosures, the presence of domestic rather than purely ceremonial structures throughout the complex all indicate that a large urban population lived here across the period of the site's occupation. The great enclosure was the city's architectural and social center. The valley ruins were the city itself. Moving between the great enclosure and the base of the hill complex in the late afternoon, crossing the valley floor on the open ground between these two poles of the city's organization, the space has a quality that is difficult to name precisely. The grass is short here, the plateau elevation, meaning the vegetation stays relatively low, and the light at this hour is level and golden, falling across the stone of the surrounding enclosures at an angle that emphasizes texture, the individual courses of the walls, the slight irregularities of the outer surfaces, the shadows collecting in the joints between blocks. The stone itself changes color with the light, the gray of the granite taking on warmth in the afternoon, in the way this variety of stone does, its slightly crystalline surface catching and scattering the angle of the sun. The conical tower is not visible from every point on the valley floor, between the hill complex and the great enclosure. The outer wall of the enclosure screens it from certain angles, but the outer wall itself is continuously present, its height marking the great enclosure's position from every point in the open valley. The chevron band along the upper exterior becomes more visible as the light drops, and the contrast between the patterned upper course and the plain wall below it increases, and from a distance of 100 meters or more, standing in the open valley floor, the zigzag line reads clearly against the sky. It is the uppermost mark on the tallest structure in the valley, set there by builders who understood what would be visible from this distance and made a decision about what that visibility should contain. The full circumference of the great enclosure's outer wall, 250 meters, can be walked in a matter of minutes, though the walk along the exterior face, pressing close enough to the stone to see the individual joints, taking in the courses at their varying heights, pausing at the points where the batter of the wall is most pronounced, runs longer than the distance alone would suggest. The wall demands a kind of attention that slows the pace. There are no inscriptions on the outer face. There are no carvings, no painted symbols, no representational marks of any kind on the exterior surface. The wall communicates through its form, its height, its solidity, its unbroken continuation around the full perimeter, the refinement of its upper decoration, and through nothing else. On the inner face of the outer wall, the surface finish changes in some sections. The interior faces of certain walls in the valley ruins and the great enclosure complex are dressed differently from their exterior faces, sometimes showing a rougher finish that was presumably intended to be plastered with Dhaka, or sometimes showing a more careful coursework that indicates the interior face received equivalent attention to the exterior. The building was thought about from both sides. If the experience of being inside the stone enclosure was considered as well as the experience of approaching it from the valley floor, the architecture worked in both directions simultaneously. The great enclosure's outer wall at its base in the late afternoon, the hands still against the stone, the warmth held in the granite, the courses fitting without mortar and fitting without visible gap. This is the physical surface of what was built here, not a rough approximation, not a primitive attempt at construction that happened to survive. A wall designed and executed with the knowledge of what makes dry stone construction stable across centuries, the selection of appropriate material, the preparation of the courses, the management of the batter, the care of the upper decoration, the sheer accumulated judgment of how to stack stone so that it holds. The blocks in the lower courses are among the largest in the wall. The coursework as it rises tends towards slightly smaller and more uniform blocks, the greater precision of fit in the upper sections, requiring more careful selection and placement of material. Near the base, where the load is greatest, the blocks have a settled, planted quality, their sheer mass contributing to the stability of the lower courses, their placement chosen for the flatness of their bearing faces rather than their decorative regularity. Higher up, the courses refine. The blocks become more consistent in their dimensions. The joints become more regular. The wall rising across 11 meters shows the progression of care that its height required. Across the valley floor to the east, the hill complex holds the last of the afternoon light on its granite summit. The stone of the kopje and the stone of the constructed walls built between its boulders are the same material. The distinction between natural and built is not immediately obvious from this distance. The summit forms a silhouette that is partly geological and partly architectural, the two working together in a way that was presumably deliberate in the original siting of the complex, using the natural height of the kopje as the foundation for the elevated position the city's most important space required. The carved soapstone birds that stood on columns at the summit are not there now. Their absence is a different kind of presence. The columns remain, or the records of their positions remain, and the sky above the summit, where they once stood against the morning light, is still there, still holding the space they occupied. The valley ruins in the late afternoon extend outward from the great enclosure in every direction, their stone walls at varying heights above the grass, their enclosures open to the sky and to the light that moves across them through the hours of the day. Some of the finer enclosures near the great enclosure retain walls of 3 and 4 meters. Further out, the walls are lower, and further out still, near the edges of the 720-hectare extent, the walls are low enough to step over. The social geography of the city is written in these heights in this variation, the elaboration of the architecture concentrated at the center, diminishing as it moves outward, the finely built stone enclosures giving way to simpler ones, giving way to the pole and Dhaka domestic structures, whose traces now exist only in the ground, giving way at last to the open plateau. Inside the great enclosure now, in the cooling of the late afternoon, the conical tower at the south end of the interior space is in partial shadow. The outer wall of the enclosure screens it from the westward falling sun, and the tower's stone surface, in shadow, loses the warmth that its peak caught in the morning. The rounded form of the upper half is still clearly defined against the sky above the enclosure, its profile consistent and smooth, the precision of its construction visible in the regularity of its silhouette. The courses at the base of the tower, where the shadow collects most deeply, are the oldest part of the structure's external face, the lowest courses, the ones that have been sitting in the same position for the longest number of seasons, with the slight polish that accumulation brings to stone in contact with the earth and the air over a long time. No one has entered this tower. There is nothing to enter. It is a solid object from its base to its rounded peak, and the question of what it meant to the people who built it and the people who lived alongside it remains exactly where it has always been, in the stone itself, which does not answer. The interpretation of the tower as a symbol of royal authority over agricultural abundance, a granary rendered permanent, a form that carried meaning within the ceremonial and political language of this specific city, rests on what scholars have been able to reconstruct from the architectural context, from comparative material in later Shona traditions, from the positioning of the tower within the great enclosure's interior. That interpretation is grounded and careful, and the most convincing account the evidence supports. The tower does not confirm or deny it. The tower is a solid object inside a stone-walled enclosure in a valley on a plateau in southern Africa, and it has been exactly that for more than 7 centuries. The morning light will find its rounded peak again tomorrow, as it found it today, and the day before today, and across all the mornings, this structure has stood in this position on the valley floor since the final block of its facing was set in place by whoever placed it last. The courses of the outer wall will still interlock without mortar. The chevron band will still run along the upper exterior face. The doorways of the valley ruins will still stand open across the 720 hectares of the site's full extent. The tower stands at the south end of the enclosure's interior in the quiet of the approaching evening, its purpose still the subject of careful study, its silence continuous and complete, its stone surface holding the residual warmth of the day as the light around it drops and the long plateau dusk comes on across the valley. 7 centuries of standing without opening, the accumulated patience of a sealed form. Whatever question the tower was designed to answer, or to embody, or to claim, it carries that question in the same way it carries its own weight, silently and without any sign of strain, beneath the granite boulders of the copia. In the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, there was already a life being lived. Iron tools moved through red soil, cattle moved through grass. The smell of clay pottery firing in an open kiln drifted upward toward the rock formations that would, centuries later, become the foundation of something much larger. The people who made those fires and shaped that clay belonged to the Gokomer cultural tradition, an early Iron Age farming and herding society whose material presence has been recovered from this plateau and dated by radiocarbon analysis to the period between roughly 300 and 500 CE. They were not a prelude. They were not a rough beginning, waiting to be refined. They were a community that had already been farming this land, tending cattle, working iron, and shaping the world around them for generations before a single dressed stone was placed on another. The plateau they occupied sits at considerable elevation above the surrounding lowlands of what is now southern Zimbabwe, a high open grassland broken by the granite formations called kopjes, their rounded gray boulders stacked by geological time into shapes that seem almost deliberate. The Gokomeri people who settled here did so in relationship with that landscape, reading it for what it offered. The soil supported sorghum and millet. The grassland supported cattle. The granite itself would, in time, support everything else. But in those earliest centuries, the settlement at what would become Great Zimbabwe was simply a place where people lived, worked, and accumulated the slow material knowledge of a plateau that rewarded careful attention. What they left behind is visible in the way archaeologists read the ground. Post holes mark where structures stood. Pottery sherds and midden deposits record what was made and used and discarded. Cattle bone accumulates in layers, each layer a year or a decade of ordinary life. The Gokomere material culture recovered at Great Zimbabwe is not spectacular in the way the later stone walls are spectacular. It is quiet, consistent, and continuous, which is a different kind of evidence, and in some ways a more telling one. It records a community so settled in its occupation of this plateau that by the time the stone building phase began, the cultural knowledge, the spatial organization, and the political authority required to undertake it had already been developing here for centuries. The transition into the stone building period was not a single event with a clear date. It was a process, gradual and accumulative, driven by the same forces that drive the elaboration of any architectural tradition: the increasing complexity of political organization, the concentration of wealth, the desire to make durable in stone what had previously been expressed in wood, thatch, and packed earth. The earliest stone walls at Great Zimbabwe are rough by comparison with the later construction. The courses are less precise, the blocks less carefully selected, the overall execution less refined. This is what a tradition looks like when it is beginning, not yet fully formed, feeling its way toward what it will eventually become. The later walls, the ones that still stand to heights of 11 meters in the great enclosure, represent the accumulated skill of many generations working with granite in a place where granite was abundant, and the knowledge of how it behaved under heat and pressure had been refined across lifetimes of practice. The Karanga people, a subgroup of the larger Shona-speaking population of southern Africa, are now identified, conclusively and without meaningful scholarly dispute, as the builders and rulers of the Great Zimbabwe Kingdom during the period of its fullest development. The identification comes not from a single source, but from a convergence of evidence: the archaeological record of the site itself, the independent work of historians working from Portuguese documentary sources, and the continuous oral traditions of the Shona people themselves, who have never forgotten that this plateau was theirs. The archaeological record and the living memory point to the same community. They have always agreed on this question. The dispute about Great Zimbabwe's origins was never at its foundation a scholarly dispute. It was a political one, and the Shona were not its participants. The political structure of the Great Zimbabwe Kingdom was organized around a supreme ruler called the Mambo. The Mambo's authority was not limited to any single domain. It was simultaneously political, economic, and spiritual, a concentration of power that made him the center from which all legitimate authority radiated outward. Subordinate chiefs governed the surrounding territories, managing the agricultural production, the cattle wealth, and the local tribute networks of their respective areas. Those chiefs, in turn, paid tribute to the center, gold, cattle, and labor flowing inward toward the royal enclosure on the plateau, sustaining the court and reinforcing the political hierarchy that gave the Mambo his power. The tribute system was not merely extractive, it was also relational, a mechanism through which loyalty was expressed, rank was confirmed, and the authority of the center was renewed through repeated acts of acknowledgement from the periphery. The hill complex, the granite boulder formation that rises approximately 80 meters above the valley floor, and that later archaeologists would call the Acropolis, was the spatial anchor of the Mambo's authority. It was the highest point on the plateau. It was the place from which the full sweep of the valley could be seen in every direction. And it was in the interpretation that the archaeological evidence most consistently supports the site of the court's ceremonial and spiritual life. The carved soapstone bird sculptures that have become the most iconic objects associated with Great Zimbabwe were recovered primarily from the hill complex, standing on their stone columns above the boulders, their forms, combining bird and human features in a way that Shona oral traditions associate with the power of royal ancestors to move between worlds. The hill complex was not simply a defensive position, though its height would have made it that too. It was the place where the Mambo's connection to the ancestral powers that legitimated his rule was most formally expressed. To understand what that legitimacy meant within the Shona framework requires some attention to the Mandoro, the lion spirit, which was the most powerful category of ancestral presence in the kingdom's religious life. When a Mambo died, his spirit did not disappear. It was understood to persist, to continue holding an interest in the welfare of the land and the people it had governed. The most senior of these royal ancestral spirits were the Mandoro, believed to reincarnate as lions and to remain active in the affairs of the living through the mediation of specialists called Svikiro, spirit mediums through whom the Mandoro could speak. A Svikiro had consulted on a question of rainfall, harvest, or political succession was not performing a ritual for its own sake. The Svikiro was serving as a channel for genuine ancestral authority, providing a mechanism through which the accumulated wisdom and political legitimacy of the dead remained available to the living. This is not a belief system that requires translation into other religious frameworks. It functions on its own terms, as completely and coherently as any system of authority that depends on the continued relevance of lineage, precedent, and ancestral sanction to the decisions of the present. Somewhere below the hill complex, in one of the finer enclosures of the valley, a Svikiro might be consulted on an afternoon when the rains had not come as expected. The enclosure's interior would be shaded by thatch, the floor-packed earth swept clean. The questions brought to the Svikiro would be specific and practical. When the rains might return, what ritual action might encourage them, whether a particular course of political action had the sanction of the ancestors who had navigated similar choices before. The answers given through the Svikiro would carry the weight of royal ancestral authority, which meant they would also carry political weight, shaping the decisions of chiefs and the Mambo himself in ways that made the spiritual and the political not two separate domains, but a single integrated system of governance. The Mandoro were not confined to the spirit medium's enclosure. They moved through the landscape. A lion seen in the territory governed by a particular royal ancestor's spirit was not simply a lion, it was a possible manifestation of the Mandoro, a presence that demanded a specific kind of attention and respect. The cattle and the crops that sustained the kingdom were understood to depend on the goodwill of these ancestral presences, which meant that maintaining right relationship with the Mondoro was not a separate activity from maintaining the agricultural and pastoral economy. The two were continuous. The spiritual life of the kingdom and its material life were organized by the same logic, and the Mambo stood at the center of both, the living embodiment of a lineage that ran backward through the dead and forward into the future of the land. The architecture of the great Zimbabwe kingdom made this hierarchy visible in stone. The closer an enclosure was to the great enclosure, and the finer and higher its walls, the more clearly it communicated the rank of whoever lived within it. Across the roughly 720 hectares of the total site, the variation in wall quality is consistent and readable, not random, not the result of different builders working to different standards, but a systematic architectural record of social position. The finest walls, the most carefully fitted courses, the most elaborate decorative elements are concentrated at the center. The rougher walls, the simpler constructions, are at the periphery. Reading that variation is reading the social structure of the kingdom in its physical form, the map of rank and proximity written in granite that has outlasted every document, every oral tradition, and every political disruption of the centuries since. Within the stone enclosures, the actual domestic life of the kingdom was conducted in structures built from pole and daca, a mixture of clay, soil, and organic material that was packed around wooden poles to create the walls and floors of houses. These structures do not survive in the way the stone walls do. Clay and organic material do not outlast centuries in the same way that fitted granite does. What survives of them is the evidence they left in the ground: post holes indicating where the structural poles stood, floors of compacted material that retain the impressions of use, pottery sherds in the deposits that accumulated around and within them. Excavation of the finer valley enclosures has recovered enough of this evidence to reconstruct the broad outlines of domestic life at Great Zimbabwe, the interior arrangements of household space, the objects used in daily life, the food remains that accumulate in midden deposits around any inhabited space. The midden deposits at the hill complex are particularly revealing in the layers of cattle bone, charcoal, and pottery sherds that accumulated over decades of occupation at the summit of the site's social hierarchy. The physical residue of a way of life is preserved, the byproducts of meals, of fires, of work, of ritual activity conducted by the people who lived closest to the center of royal authority. Cattle bone is by far the most common large mammal material in these deposits. The patterns of tooth, wear on the cattle remains indicate that some of these animals were kept to advanced ages, not simply raised for slaughter, but maintained for the ongoing contributions of milk and labor that made them central to the kingdom's wealth in a way that their meat value alone would not explain. The cattle at Great Zimbabwe were not just food, they were currency and social capital, and a measure of a man's standing that was visible and mobile in a way that gold stored in a royal enclosure was not. Below the hill complex and the great enclosure, spreading across the valley floor and extending to the plateau's edges, the majority of the city's population lived outside the stone walls entirely. The stone enclosures housed the elite, the Mambo's court, the highest-ranking chiefs and their families, the specialists whose proximity to power was marked by the quality of the walls around them. The tens of thousands of people who were estimated to have occupied Great Zimbabwe at the height of its development lived in the thatched and pole and daca structures that extended across the full 720 hectares of the built environment. They were farmers, herders, potters, Iron workers, weavers, traders, the full population of an urban settlement that was doing what cities do, concentrating people, specializing labor, and organizing the relationship between those who held authority and those who sustained the material conditions that made authority possible. The number of people that Great Zimbabwe supported at its peak has been estimated by scholars at somewhere between 10 and 18,000, a range that reflects both the genuine uncertainty of archaeological population estimates and the genuine scale of the settlement. Even at the lower end of that estimate, 10,000 people is a significant urban population for any medieval city anywhere in the world. At the higher end, 18,000 is a city that demands a sophisticated and well-organized relationship with the surrounding agricultural land, the water sources of the plateau, the trade networks that brought in what the plateau could not produce, and the political mechanisms that managed conflict, allocated resources, and maintained the conditions under which that many people could live together in one place without the whole system collapsing under its own weight. What sustained that system at its broadest scale was the combination of cattle wealth, agricultural production, and the gold trade that connected the plateau to the wider world. But within the daily life of the city, what held it together was something more like the ordinary fabric of any large human settlement: the rhythms of grinding grain, tending cattle, firing pottery, smelting iron, conducting the ceremonies and the negotiations and the commercial transactions that keep 10,000 people fed, housed, and organized. Grain grinding was a sound that would have been continuous across the city on any given morning, the flat stones moving in their regular rhythm across the grain. The millet and sorghum that formed the dietary foundation of the city's population being processed for the day's meals. Cattle moved across the valley floor in the early morning and again at dusk, tended by the herders, whose work was as central to the kingdom's function as the political deliberations of the Mambo's court. The pottery traditions of the Great Zimbabwe Kingdom are documented in detail in the archaeological record. The ceramic assemblages recovered from excavated deposits at the site are consistent across their development with the broader Shona pottery tradition, showing the continuity of a craft practice that was not imported, not derivative of any external tradition, but developed locally over many generations of potters working with the clay resources of the plateau. The forms are specific, the shapes of storage vessels, cooking pots, all, and serving bowls reflect the particular material requirements and aesthetic preferences of the Karanga community at Great Zimbabwe, and they change over time in ways that allow archaeologists to use pottery typology as a dating tool, reading the stratigraphic sequence of a deposit, partly through the ceramic styles present in each layer. The pottery is in this sense a written record, not alphabetic, but legible to those who have learned to read it. The ironworking tradition of the plateau was similarly developed and sustained within the community itself. The tools recovered from excavation deposits, blades, points, the everyday implements of agricultural and domestic life, were made from ore smelted on the plateau and worked by smiths whose knowledge was accumulated and transmitted within the community across generations. Ironworking in the Shona tradition was not simply a technical practice. It was a socially embedded one, surrounded by protocols and specialist knowledge that gave the smith a particular status within the community, a position that was not entirely separable from the spiritual dimensions of working with fire and metal to transform one material into another. The iron tools that ended up in the midden deposits of the valley enclosures were not simply objects. They were the products of a specific social and technical tradition with its own history and its own internal logic. Across the full extent of the 720 hectare site at any moment during the period of the kingdom's greatest development. The sound of the city would have been continuous. Grain grinding, cattle movement, the strike of iron tools, the voices of traders negotiating in the enclosures near the great enclosure, the particular silence of the hill complex in the early morning before the court began its day. The stone walls enclosed all of this and framed it, creating the spatial structure within which the social life of the kingdom was organized. The walls were not the city. The walls were the skeleton of the city, the durable record that outlasted everything soft and perishable, everything organic and human, everything that was the actual substance of the lives lived inside and around them. The Mambo moved through this city not simply as a political authority, but as a sacred presence. His physical person was surrounded by protocols that marked the boundary between the ordinary and the royal in spatial and behavioral terms. What he ate, how he was seen, the terms on which others could approach him, the ceremonial calendar that structured his public appearances. All of these were part of a system of royal behavior that communicated the Mambo's position as simultaneously the most powerful living person in the kingdom and the living representative of the royal ancestral line that extended back through generations of previous Mambos and forward into the future of the land. The care taken to mark this position in architectural terms, the height of the walls that enclosed his court, the elevation of the hill complex, the elaborate stone detailing of the great enclosure, was not separate from the political authority the Mambo exercised. It was part of how that authority was constructed and maintained. The royal court at Great Zimbabwe would have included, beyond the Mambo's immediate family, the specialists and advisors whose various forms of knowledge were essential to the management of a complex kingdom, the Svikiro who maintained the relationship with the Mondoro, the chiefs of the subordinate territories who maintained their presence at the royal center as a condition of their political relationships, the traders and their intermediaries who managed the movement of gold, ivory, and imported goods through the kingdom's networks, the craftspeople whose work was required for the maintenance of the royal household, the oral specialists, historians, genealogists, praise singers, whose work was to maintain the verbal record of the dynasty and to perform it in contexts where its public expression was part of the political event. The court was not a simple thing. It was an institution that concentrated, in one place, the full range of specialist knowledge required to govern a complex polity, sustain a long-distance trade network, and maintain the ceremonial life that legitimated the whole arrangement. The women of the royal court occupied positions within this structure that the archaeological record does not fully document. The post holes and pottery sherds of excavation tell only certain kinds of stories, and the internal social life of the royal enclosures, the distribution of authority and decision-making within the domestic sphere of the court, is not recoverable in the same precise terms as the architectural layout. What can be said is that the households of a Karanga court were organized according to a set of social principles that the later ethnographic and historical record of Shona communities documents in some detail, principles governing marriage, inheritance, the management of domestic space, and the relationship between a man's household and the broader political unit to which it was attached. These principles were not absent at Great Zimbabwe. They were present in the daily life of every household in the city, from the Mambo's court on the hill complex to the simplest family group at the outer edge of the built environment. The children growing up at Great Zimbabwe in the 14th century would have known the city as simply the place where they lived, the stone walls a given feature of the landscape, The hill complex, a presence above the valley that defined the visual horizon of their daily world. They would have known the particular sound of cattle moving in the early morning. They would have known the rhythms of the agricultural seasons, the preparation of the fields, the planting of sorghum and millet, the long middle period of tending and waiting, the harvest and the storing that came with the rain's end. They would have known the market spaces near the great enclosure, where traders moved goods and people exchanged the products of their labor. They would have known the ceremonial occasions that marked the calendar of the kingdom's spiritual life, the rituals connected with the Mondoro, the ceremonies of planting and harvest, the events associated with the Mambo's court that periodically drew the wider population into collective participation. This was not a simple world. It was not a small world. It was a city with the full complexity that the word implies. Differentiated, hierarchical, economically specialized, spiritually elaborate, and deeply organized in ways that the stone walls only partially reveal. The walls are what remains. They are remarkable walls. But the city that built them was larger than its walls in every direction, in the number of its people, in the extent of its trade connections, in the sophistication of its political and spiritual organization, and in the depth of its accumulated cultural knowledge. The stone walls enclose a silence now. At the height of the kingdom's development, they enclosed something much louder and much warmer than that. Outside the walls, at the edges of the 720-hectare built environment, where the stone construction gave way to the open plateau, the city dissolved gradually into the agricultural land that fed it. There was no sharp boundary between urban and rural at Great Zimbabwe. The city extended outward along the gradients of density and formality until it became indistinguishable from the farming settlements that surrounded it. The cattle pastures that sustained the kingdom's wealth were nearby. The fields that produced the sorghum and millet were nearby. The woodlands that supplied the fuel for iron smelting and pottery firing were nearby, or had been nearby, and were being steadily consumed by the demands of the city's production. The landscape around Great Zimbabwe bore the marks of a large human settlement's long occupation, modified, utilized, and in some places visibly strained by the demands placed on it over generations of intensive use. The oral traditions of the Shona people have preserved, across the centuries since the kingdom's peak, fragments of memory about the Mambos and the ancestral spirits associated with the Zimbabwe plateau. Names, lineages, accounts of political events, the genealogies of royal lines that trace their authority back to the period when the stone walls were being built and occupied. These traditions were not collected or written down in a systematic form until relatively recently, and the relationship between their content and the archaeological record is not a simple one-to-one correspondence, but they represent a form of historical knowledge that has its own integrity and its own evidentiary value, the accumulated memory of a community about its own past, maintained through oral transmission across many generations because that past was considered worth remembering. The city that the oral traditions and the archaeological record together describe was, on any given ordinary day, simply going about its life. The grain was being ground. The cattle were moving across the valley floor as the morning light came over the copios. The potters were working their clay. The traders were negotiating in the enclosures near the great enclosure. The Savikiro was receiving those who came with questions for the ancestors. The Mambo's court was conducting the business of governing a kingdom that stretched well beyond the visible horizon, and across the full expanse of the plateau, from the hill complex at its highest point to the outer edge of the built environment, where the stone walls thinned and the open grassland began. Somewhere between 10 and 18,000 people were moving through their day in the full ordinary complexity of a civilization at the complete and unremarkable height of its ordinary life. The Zimbabwe Plateau rises above the surrounding lowlands in the dark hours before dawn, its elevated grassland broken by granite formations that emerge from the earth in rounded out crops, weathered smooth over geological time, holding the last of the night's coolness in their surfaces. Beneath that plateau, in formations that geologists describe as Precambrian greenstone belts, gold-bearing quartz reefs run through the rock in seams that have existed since before the continent took its present shape. The land itself, at the level of its deep geology, was the reason this city existed. The stone walls, the conical tower, the carved birds on their columns, all of it began here, in the mineral composition of a landscape that had been waiting for someone to understand what it held and how to move it through the world. The greenstone belts of the Zimbabwe Plateau are ancient formations, their gold content distributed through quartz reefs and alluvial deposits that erosion had, over millennia, concentrated into workable quantities along stream beds and exposed rock faces. Geologists studying historical mining records across the region have estimated that the ancient extraction operations of the plateau, carried out over the centuries of the kingdom's peak activity, removed somewhere between 20 and 40 tons of gold in total. That is not a figure drawn from a single document or a single excavation. It is a reconstruction built from evidence accumulated across multiple research programs, the location of ancient mine workings, the scale of spoil heaps, the chemical signatures of extracted ore, the distribution of gold objects through excavated contexts across the wider region. The range reflects genuine uncertainty. The scale it describes does not. Gold, in the medieval world, moved through networks that crossed distances most individual traders would never travel in a lifetime. The metal left the plateau as finished objects and as raw material carried by traders through intermediaries, passing from hand to hand across overland routes toward the Mozambique coast. It arrived at the sea as the accumulated extraction of generations, the product of labor organized and controlled at the center of a kingdom whose rulers understood, with considerable sophistication, that what lay beneath the grass and granite of their plateau was what the wider world wanted. The coastal city of Sofala sat on a narrow strip of the Mozambique coast, positioned where river estuaries met the sea, in a geography that made it the natural threshold between overland trade routes and ocean-going merchant networks. The gold and ivory that moved down from the Zimbabwe Plateau reached Sofala through a chain of intermediary exchanges, carried by traders working shorter sections of the route, accumulated at staging points, eventually arriving at the coast in quantities sufficient to support a sustained trade economy. At Sofala, the Swahili and Arab merchants who operated the Indian Ocean's western coastal networks received those goods and distributed them northward along the East African coast, where they entered the wider Afro-Eurasian trading world. The city was, in the terminology contemporary geographers would later use, an entrepot, a place whose prosperity depended not on what it produced, but on what it received from one direction and sent on toward another. From Sofala, the trade routes ran north along the East African coast to a chain of Swahili port cities whose wealth derived directly from this commerce. Among them, Kilwa Kisiwani, situated on an island off the present-day Tanzanian coast, became the dominant entrepot for the gold moving out of the plateau's hinterland. The Moroccan traveler and geographer Ibn Battuta arrived at Kilwa in 1330 CE and recorded what he found there in his Rihla, the account of his journeys that remains one of the most detailed first-hand descriptions of the medieval Indian Ocean world. He described Kilwa as one of the most beautiful and well-governed cities in the world. Its buildings were constructed in coral stone, its rulers dressed in silk, its markets moved goods that had arrived from distant places and were destined for places more distant still. The prosperity Ibn Battuta observed and recorded was inseparable from the gold that arrived there from the African interior, from the elevated plateau, where the Zimbabwe kingdom controlled both the extraction and the movement of that metal through the first stages of its long journey. The distance from the great Zimbabwe ruins to the island of Kilwa Kisiwani, traveling the overland and coastal routes that the trade actually followed, runs to something in the range of 2,000 kilometers. The gold that left the Zimbabwe plateau and arrived at Kilwa had been extracted, processed, and traded through a series of exchanges across that entire distance before it was loaded onto the docks that carried it across the Indian Ocean. What Ibn Battuta saw when he looked at Kilwa's coral stone, buildings, and well-dressed merchants was the accumulated result of that movement, the transformation of what lay in the greenstone belts of a landlocked plateau into the visible wealth of a coastal city that commanded the admiration of one of the medieval world's most practiced travelers. Inside the great Zimbabwe site itself, the evidence of gold processing has been recovered from excavated contexts across decades of work. Crucible fragments bearing gold residues have been cataloged from deposits within and immediately adjacent to the urban settlement. Small gold objects, wire drawn into thin filaments, beaten into beads, cut into sheets of delicate thinness, have appeared in stratified layers alongside the ceramics and iron tools of local manufacture. These are not objects that arrived at Great Zimbabwe as finished imports from elsewhere. The technology to draw gold into wire, to fabricate it into the small ornamented forms recovered from the site, was present within the city's own walls. The rulers of the Zimbabwe kingdom did not simply pass raw gold along to coastal traders. They processed it. They fabricated from it. They exercised, in other words, not just commercial, but productive control over the metal that anchored their kingdom's reach into the wider world. The archaeology of metalworking at Great Zimbabwe extends beyond gold alone. Iron slag deposits, ceramic tuyères, and the remnants of clay smelting furnaces have been identified at the site, indicating that iron production was also conducted within or immediately adjacent to the urban settlement. A tuyère is a bellows nozzle, the ceramic tube through which air was forced into the furnace to raise its temperature to the point where iron ore could be reduced. The ones recovered from Great Zimbabwe carry the glassy surface produced by repeated exposure to furnace heat, their clay vitrified at temperatures sufficient to smelt iron ore and hold the result. The presence of this equipment, alongside iron slag and the structural remains of furnace installations, confirms that the city's economic life was not organized around trade alone. Production was part of the picture, the controlled fabrication of iron tools and implements alongside the processing of gold, all of it concentrated within a settlement whose rulers understood that controlling production and controlling trade were two aspects of the same political power. The Indian Ocean trade network that connected Great Zimbabwe's gold to the markets of Arabia, Persia, and beyond was not a simple bilateral exchange, one African kingdom sending gold to one Arabian market. It was a layered system of merchant relationships, seasonal sailing patterns, shared commercial infrastructure, and accumulated specialized knowledge that had developed over centuries before the Zimbabwe kingdom reached its peak. Arab DOS crossing the Indian Ocean used the monsoon winds, sailing southwest toward the African coast between November and March, and returning northeast between April and October, a pattern that made the ocean navigable on a predictable annual schedule and that organized the rhythms of coastal commerce accordingly. The merchants who operated within this system knew the coastlines, the anchorages, the seasonal availability of trade goods, the political conditions of the ports they called at, the credit arrangements that allowed goods to move between parties who would not meet again for a year. The Zimbabwe Kingdom's gold entered this system not as an accidental discovery, but as a deliberate commercial relationship sustained across generations by the kingdom's consistent ability to supply what the system wanted. The evidence that this relationship was real and sustained is not confined to the coastal record. It is present at Great Zimbabwe itself in the form of objects that had traveled from the other end of the trade network to end up in a city on an elevated African plateau, thousands of kilometers from where they were made. Fragments of Chinese celadon have been recovered from excavated deposits at the site. The pale green glazed stoneware produced in Song Dynasty kilns during a period when Chinese ceramic production was the most technically sophisticated in the world. Blue and white porcelain shards attributable to Yuan and early Ming Dynasty workshops have also been cataloged from the site's excavation record. Persian and Islamic glassware fragments, their chemical composition matching kilns operating on the Persian Gulf Coast and in the Iranian plateau, have appeared in the same stratified contexts alongside local Shona pottery and iron objects. These are not the goods of a civilization that operated in isolation. They are the imports of a sovereign trading state, receiving the high-value luxury production of distant manufacturing centers in exchange for the gold and ivory that those centers could not obtain anywhere else on comparable terms. A fragment of Song Dynasty celadon recovered from a stratified deposit at Great Zimbabwe represents a specific journey. It was fired in a Chinese kiln during a dynasty whose imperial court was, in its own historical moment, one of the largest and most complex administrative systems in the world. It was exported from China through a network of maritime merchants who distributed Chinese ceramics across Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean coast, and the Arabian Peninsula. It arrived on the East African coast, carried in the hold of a dhow, whose captain and crew navigated by the monsoon winds and the accumulated navigational knowledge of generations. It moved inland from the coast through the intermediary trading networks that connected Sofala to the plateau. It reached Great Zimbabwe, was used or stored within one of the city's stone enclosures, was broken, was covered by subsequent occupation layers, and was recovered from those layers by archaeologists working in the 20th century, who identified it by its glaze chemistry and its kiln mark as Chinese stoneware of a specific period. The distance between that Chinese kiln and the excavation tray at Great Zimbabwe measures thousands of kilometers. The fragment itself is a few centimeters of pale green ceramic. Its presence in that tray is the most material kind of historical evidence, a physical object whose existence in that specific place can only be explained by the functioning of the trade network that put it there. The ivory that moved alongside gold through the same coastal networks came from the elephant populations of the plateau and surrounding lowlands. Elephant ivory was among the most valuable commodities in the medieval luxury market. Its density, its workability, its capacity to be carved into intricate forms made it sought after in the workshops of Arabia, Persia, India, and China for the production of decorative objects, gaming pieces, and luxury goods, whose markets spanned the full width of the Afro-Eurasian world. The Zimbabwe kingdom's position on a plateau whose surrounding lowlands supported substantial elephant populations, gave it consistent access to ivory at the source, making it a reliable supplier within a trading system whose other nodes, the coastal cities, the ocean-going merchants, the Indian Ocean markets, depended on that reliability. Gold and ivory together formed the commercial foundation on which the kingdom's external relationships rested. Each sustained the other's value. Within the plateau itself, the economic foundation that made long-distance trade possible rested on cattle. The interior social economy of the Zimbabwe kingdom was built around cattle wealth in ways that structured rank, obligation, alliance, and the daily material life of the city's population. Faunal remains excavated from midden deposits at the hill complex and across the site show cattle as by far the most commonly represented large mammal. Analysis of tooth wear patterns on recovered cattle teeth indicates that some animals were kept to advanced ages, suggesting they were valued for milk and labor rather than solely for meat, a pattern consistent with the cattle economies documented in later Shona communities and in the broader ethnographic record of southern African societies that maintained cattle as the primary unit of social value. The cattle herds of the Zimbabwe kingdom were not merely a food source. They were the material expression of social rank, the medium of tribute payment between subordinate chiefs, and the mambo at the center, the currency in which political relationships were maintained and obligations were discharged. The valley floor surrounding the stone enclosures supported this internal economy on an everyday basis. Cattle moved across the plateau's grasslands on daily grazing circuits, managed by herders whose labor was part of the broader organization of the city's working population. Grain, sorghum, and millet, their charred remains identified in botanical samples from excavated deposits, was grown in agricultural land that extended outward from the urban core into the surrounding plateau, tended by farming households whose produce moved inward toward the city's center as part of the tribute and redistribution system that fed an urban population of the scale the city represented. The external trade that connected Great Zimbabwe to Kilwa and the Indian Ocean world rested ultimately on this internal agricultural and pastoral economy, the grain that fed the city, the cattle that embodied its social relationships, the labor organized through its hierarchical structure that made everything else possible. The Swahili cities of the East African coast maintained their own complex relationships with the Indian Ocean world, and the largest among them were urban centers of considerable sophistication in their own right: coral stone architecture, literate administrative cultures, cosmopolitan merchant populations who spoke Arabic alongside their coastal Swahili languages, libraries and mosques, and harbor infrastructure built to accommodate the ocean-going trade on which their prosperity depended. These cities were not intermediaries in a passive sense. They were active economic agents managing the terms on which interior goods reached the ocean, maintaining the commercial relationships with Arab and Persian merchants that translated African gold and ivory into the luxury imports that moved back along the same routes in the opposite direction. Kilwa's position as the dominant gold entrepot on the coast was the product of its own commercial and political capabilities, not simply geography. Ibn Battuta's admiration for the city in 1330 CE was admiration for a functioning urban civilization that knew what it was doing and did it well. The relationship between Great Zimbabwe and the coastal cities was, in this sense, a relationship between equals, in the sense that matters commercially. Neither party could sustain its economy without the other, and both parties knew it. The Zimbabwe kingdom controlled the gold at its source. The coastal cities controlled the ocean access through which that gold reached its markets. Neither could substitute for the other in the chain. The sophistication of the relationship was in the maintenance of that mutual dependency across generations, through changes of political leadership on both ends, through the fluctuations in demand that market conditions across the Indian Ocean world imposed, through the logistical challenges of moving heavy goods across hundreds of kilometers of interior terrain between the plateau and the sea. What arrived at Great Zimbabwe in exchange for its gold and ivory was, in the archaeological record, a particular selection of high-value goods. Chinese ceramics and Persian glassware were luxury objects, not necessities, not tools, not food. Their presence in the excavated deposits of Great Zimbabwe, particularly in contexts associated with the hill complex and the finer enclosures of the valley ruins, suggests that access to imported luxury goods was concentrated within the city's social elite, forming part of the material language through which rank was expressed and maintained. A mambo who could display imported Chinese porcelain and Persian glass alongside domestically produced gold objects and soapstone carvings was a ruler who demonstrated, through the objects that surrounded him, that his authority extended beyond the plateau into the wider world, that the trade networks which moved through his kingdom's territory moved at his direction, under his control, and to his benefit. The soapstone Zimbabwe birds that stood on their carved columns at the hill complex occupied a different position in this material vocabulary. They were not imports. They were the product of local craftsmanship applied to local stone, carved soapstone, a material found in the geology of the plateau itself, worked into forms whose iconographic meaning was rooted in the Karanga religious and political tradition. The birds on their columns represented the connection between living royal authority and the ancestral spirits, whose continued governance of the land was mediated through the Mundoro tradition. 8 of these sculptures are known from the archaeological record, each one a product of craft knowledge and symbolic intention that belonged entirely to the civilization that produced them. They sat at the summit of the hill complex above the full sweep of the valley ruins, looking out across a landscape that was simultaneously a cattle-grazing plateau, an agricultural hinterland, and the inland terminus of a trade network that reached across the ocean to China and Persia. The birds were not a response to the outside world. They were the kingdom's statement about itself, made in its own material and its own symbolic language, set above everything else on the highest point the plateau offered. The trade network that sustained the Zimbabwe kingdom at its peak functioned because the plateau's gold was genuinely valuable to the markets that received it, and because the kingdom's organizational capacity was sufficient to move that gold through the necessary stages of extraction, processing, and transit to the coast with enough consistency to maintain the commercial relationships on which its external economy depended. These are not qualities that emerge accidentally. They are the properties of a political system with sufficient institutional continuity to sustain complex economic relationships across time, to keep the trade routes functioning through successions of mambos, through shifts in the specific merchants at the coastal end of the network, through the ordinary disruptions that any long-distance trading relationship absorbs and recovers from over generations. The gold moving out of the greenstone belts towards Sofala and onward to Kilaya and the Indian Ocean was not the product of an improvised or episodic commercial relationship. It was the output of a sustained institutional capacity organized around the control of a specific and valuable resource. The centuries during which the Zimbabwe kingdom occupied the center of this network were, by the measure of regional history, a long time, from the period of intensifying urban occupation around 1100 CE through to the gradual decline of the city's centrality in the mid-15th century. Roughly 300 years of functioning civilization accumulated at this site, 3 centuries of stone construction, gold extraction, cattle herding, grain farming, ritual observance at the hill complex, and commercial exchange with the Indian Ocean world. The durability of the city's economic position across that period reflects the durability of the underlying resource. The greenstone belts did not exhaust themselves in a generation, and the durability of the political system that managed access to it. The end of Great Zimbabwe's centrality, placed by the available evidence at approximately 1420 to 1450 CE, did not arrive as a sudden rupture. The evidence for how the city's dominance declined points toward a combination of factors that accumulated gradually over decades. The trade routes through which gold moved toward the coast began shifting northward toward the Zambezi River Valley, where new gold-producing regions were becoming accessible to trading networks operating under the authority of the successor kingdom of Mutapa. The Mutapa kingdom, emerging from the same Karanga political tradition as the Zimbabwe kingdom, gained control of these new gold sources, and with them the commercial relationships that had previously flowed through Great Zimbabwe. As the Mutapa's territory expanded northward, the economic gravity of the region moved with it, and the commercial advantages that had made the Zimbabwe plateau the center of the regional economy became less decisive. Alongside this political and commercial shift, the evidence from botanical remains and soil studies at the site suggests that the land immediately surrounding the city had, over centuries of intensive occupation, experienced the ecological pressures that large urban populations impose on their local environments. Deforestation, consistent with the sustained demand for timber and charcoal from a city of tens of thousands of people, maintained across several centuries, has been identified in pollen records and charcoal assemblages from the site's excavation contexts. Soil degradation in the agricultural zones surrounding the city may have placed increasing pressure on the food production capacity that sustained the urban population. These are not dramatic events. They are the slow consequences of sustained human presence on a landscape, pressures that would have accumulated over decades, reducing the margins that made the city's large population viable in its existing location. The stone walls of Great Zimbabwe remained standing as the city's population dispersed. The great enclosure's outer wall, nearly 11 meters high at its peak, built from close to 1 million individually placed granite blocks without mortar, was not dismantled when the political and commercial center of the Karanga world moved northward. It simply remained as it had been built to remain, in the dry stone tradition that makes walls whose survival depends not on binding material, but on the precision of their stacking and the durability of the stone itself. The conical tower inside the great enclosure remained. The chevron-patterned band near the top of the outer wall remained. The platforms and enclosures of the hill complex, where the carved birds had stood on their stone columns above the valley, remained. The northward movement of the trade routes and the emergence of the Mutapa kingdom were not, in the long perspective, a loss so much as a continuation. The same political tradition, the same cultural inheritance, the same Karanga organizational capacity, operating from a new center because the commercial and ecological conditions that had made the old center dominant had shifted. The plateau's gold had sustained an urban civilization for 3 centuries. When the gold trade moved, the civilization moved with it, carrying its traditions, its hierarchical structures, its religious practices, and its architectural knowledge Northward toward the Zambezi, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe were left behind, not as ruins of a collapsed society, but as the durable physical record of a center that had served its purpose and whose successors had found a new one. The trade goods that remain in the excavation record at Great Zimbabwe, the Chinese celadon, the Persian glass, the gold crucible fragments, the iron slag, and the tuyères, are evidence of a specific historical moment in a specific place. They document the period when this plateau, these stone walls, these carved birds on their columns, were the inland point of origin for a commercial network that stretched across the Indian Ocean to the workshops of China and Persia. The merchants at Safala knew where the gold came from, even if the Chinese potters who fired the celadon that eventually arrived at Great Zimbabwe's hill complex in exchange for it had no knowledge of the plateau that sent for their goods. The trade operated at the level of accumulated relationships, each link in the chain knowing the link adjacent to it, the full extent of the network visible only from outside it, in the perspective of distance and retrospect that the archaeological record makes available. That record shows a city operating with full commercial sovereignty, exporting the gold it controlled, importing the goods it chose to receive, sustaining its internal economy through cattle and grain and the organized labor of a large urban population, and maintaining its political authority through a hierarchical system whose religious, economic, and military dimensions were integrated at the level of the Mambo's central role. The Indian Ocean world did not build Great Zimbabwe, it traded with it. The distinction is not trivial. The trade goods that arrived at the site from China and Persia arrived because the city had something those markets wanted, and because the city's rulers organized the supply of that something in a way that made sustained commercial exchange possible across the enormous distances the network involved. The porcelain shard in the excavation tray is a record of that exchange. It is not evidence of an outside civilization having reached into the African interior and elevated what it found there. It is evidence of a civilization on the African interior having reached outward into the world on its own terms and received what it sent for in return. The plateau sits at its elevation above the surrounding lowlands, as it has always sat, the grass moving in the wind that comes across the open country, the granite kopjes emerging from the soil in their rounded formations, the greenstone belts running their gold-bearing seams through the deep rock far below the surface. The Matatapa Kingdom's traders, moving northward along the routes toward the Zambezi, carried with them the knowledge of how gold was found, extracted, processed, and moved through the networks that connected the interior of the continent to the ocean. The stone walls on the plateau behind them retained the forms that the people who built them had given them, the outer wall of the great enclosure curving across the ground in its great arc, the conical tower rising sealed and silent inside the enclosure's interior. The platforms of the hill complex open to the sky, where the carved birds had stood. The trade routes that had run through this place for 3 centuries ran now through other places. The commercial relationships that had made this city the center of the regional gold economy had moved north, following the geography of new gold sources and new political arrangements. The city's stone architecture, the accumulated labor of generations, the dry stone construction that required no mortar because it required instead the patience to place each block with sufficient precision that friction and gravity together held the wall, remained exactly where it had been built, in the grass of an elevated plateau above the ancient greenstone belts, gradually growing quieter over the decades as the population dispersed and the economic center of gravity moved on. The walls held their courses, the towers stood, The trade that had once moved through this place now moved elsewhere, and the stone enclosures sat in the grass, present and complete, waiting for the next version of the story they had always been part of to begin its telling. Karl Marx arrived at Great Zimbabwe in September 1871, led there by a European trader named Adam Renders, who had been living in the area for some years and knew the landscape well. The Karanga people who inhabited the surrounding territory had not considered the ruins lost. They had not been waiting for anyone to find them. The stone walls of the great enclosure stood exactly where they had always stood, on the same plateau, under the same sky, enclosed within the same grassland, broken by granite kopjes, and the people whose ancestors had raised those walls moved through the landscape around them as they always had, tending cattle and planting sorghum and conducting the ordinary business of their lives in the proximity of a place they had never needed a European to name for them. Mocha carried with him a set of assumptions so fully formed that the ruins, as he encountered them, functioned not as evidence to be examined, but as a surface onto which those assumptions could be projected. He was a geologist by training, and in principle he had come to document. What he produced instead was something closer to a confirmation of what he had already decided the ruins must mean. Within days of arriving, he had concluded that the great enclosure had been modeled on the palace of the Queen of Sheba, and that the hill complex, rising some 80 meters above the valley floor on its granite boulders, represented the form of Solomon's temple. These conclusions were not arrived at through material analysis. They were not supported by any artifact he examined, any structural feature he measured, or any stratigraphic observation he recorded. They were supported by his prior beliefs about what Africa was and was not capable of producing on its own. One detail that has survived in his notes is worth pausing over. Mensch examined a fragment of wood taken from one of the site's lintels and noted to himself that it smelled like cedar. He recorded this observation not as a tentative impression, subject to verification, but as a piece of evidence, his argument being that cedar did not grow in southern Africa, that the wood must therefore have been imported, and that an imported cedar lintel pointed toward Solomonic origin. The Karanga guides who had brought him to the site, who knew the surrounding landscape and its timber with the detailed familiarity of people who had lived within it for generations, were not consulted on the matter of local wood species. Their knowledge was not the kind of knowledge Mach was prepared to receive. He stood inside the great enclosure with a fragment of wood in his hand and a conclusion already formed, and what he saw confirmed what he already believed. His published accounts circulated through European scholarly and popular channels and found a receptive audience. The idea that a monumental stone city in the African interior could only be explained by the intervention of some ancient, presumably Semitic civilization, aligned with what the colonial world of the late 19th century was already inclined to believe about Africa. The ruins were too large, too precisely built, too architecturally coherent to fit within the prevailing European understanding of what African societies could produce, and the simplest resolution of this difficulty, within the assumptions of the period, was to conclude that Africans had not produced them. The conclusion preceded the evidence. The evidence was then arranged around it. The year 1895 produced a different kind of document, a grant of rights issued by the British South Africa Company, the colonial enterprise controlled by Cecil Rhodes, conferring on a private organization called the Ancient Ruins Company authority over Zimbabwean archaeological sites. What this meant in practice was that the ruins of a civilization, its physical archive of material culture, the stratigraphic record of its centuries of habitation, were handed to a commercial concern, whose interest was not knowledge but extraction. The Ancient Ruins Company excavated Great Zimbabwe and numerous other sites across the region, not to understand what they contained, but to remove from them whatever could be sold. Gold objects were taken, soapstone carvings were taken, artifacts whose precise location within the site's layered deposits would have allowed a trained archaeologist to read the sequence of occupation, the dates of construction phases, the cultural associations of specific objects with specific periods. All of this was removed without documentation, without measurement, without any record of where within the stratified soil each object had been found. The irreversibility of that loss is difficult to communicate without overstating it, and the facts communicate it more precisely than any amplification could. A stratified archaeological deposit is not simply a collection of objects. It is a temporal sequence, a record, written in the accumulation of centuries of what was happening at the site and when. An object found in a particular layer can be dated, can be associated with other objects from the same period, can be placed within a sequence of cultural change. Once that object is removed without documentation of its position, the information it carried is gone, not diminished, gone. The Ancient Ruins Company removed that information from Great Zimbabwe and from site after site across the region in the service of a commercial enterprise that had been granted its authority by a colonial government, and the loss was not incidental to the operation. The operation was the loss. Richard Nicklin Hall arrived at Great Zimbabwe in 1902, appointed curator of the site by the governing colonial administration. He brought to the position a conviction already settled in his mind about what the ruins were and what they were not. Hall did not believe they had been built by the Bantu-speaking ancestors of the local African population. He believed, in alignment with the prevailing colonial interpretation, that they had been built by some earlier, non-African civilization, Semitic, Arabian, Phoenician. The specific attribution varied, but the foundational premise was constant. The ruins could not have been built by the people who had been living in their proximity for centuries. That premise was not a conclusion he had reached by examining the evidence. It was the framework within which he examined everything he found. His excavation of the site proceeded from this premise with methodical thoroughness. Hall removed up to 12 feet of stratified archaeological deposits, layer after layer of accumulated cultural material representing centuries of occupation from significant portions of the site. The material he removed included charcoal layers that could have been radiocarbon dated, pottery sherds whose forms and decorative styles would have allowed cultural attribution, iron tools and slag deposits indicating the metalworking activity of specific periods, organic material that could have established what the site's inhabitants were eating and when. All of this came out in wheelbarrows. It was not analyzed. It was not documented in the stratigraphic detail that would have preserved its information. It was removed because Hall had decided in advance that it represented the debris of African occupation overlaid on the earlier non-African construction he was looking for, and he was clearing the later material to get to what lay beneath. What lay beneath was more of the same. The pottery did not change character. The iron tools did not give way to bronze ones. The cultural sequence, as the deposits went deeper, remained consistent with the material culture of the Bantu-speaking Iron Age societies of the region. There was no layer of Phoenician artifacts. There was no transition point at which the stratigraphy shifted to indicate a different population. Hall did not revise his conclusions on the basis of this finding. He published a book in 1905 titled Great Zimbabwe Mashonaland, Rhodesia, arguing for non-African, Semitic, or Arabian origins, and the book circulated through colonial libraries and offices as a scholarly authority on the subject. It was pseudo-scholarly in its form, precise in its language, systematic in its organization, and politically motivated in its foundational premise. The form gave it credibility it had not earned. The book found readers who were prepared to accept it, not because its methodology was rigorous, but because its conclusions aligned with what those readers needed to believe. A colonial administration governing a territory in the name of a civilization it considered superior required the material record of that territory to confirm the inferiority of the people it was governing. A stone city of the scale and sophistication of Great Zimbabwe complicated that narrative. Hall's book resolved the complication. The stone city had not been built by the people the colonial administration was governing. It had been built by someone else, someone older, someone from elsewhere, and those builders were gone, and what remained was a ruin that the local population had nothing to do with. The political utility of this conclusion was not incidental. It was the reason the conclusion was welcomed and widely distributed and treated as authoritative by people who should have known better. David Randall McSeaver arrived at Great Zimbabwe in 1905. He came under different auspices than Hall, not as a colonial administrator's appointee, but as an archaeologist conducting what would become the first scientifically rigorous examination of the site. He worked in the deposits that Hall's excavations had not yet reached, the portions of the site where the stratigraphy remained intact and could be read in the way a trained archaeologist was trained to read it. He worked slowly and methodically. He kept careful records of what he found in each layer and where in the sequence each layer sat. His field notes accumulated in columns of precise observation, ceramic types, structural remains, iron objects, charcoal deposits, the spatial relationships between different categories of material, and what those columns showed, consistently and without exception, was a continuous sequence of artifacts produced by local African cultures. There was no foreign material in the sequence. There were no artifacts indicating the presence of a Semitic or Arabian or Phoenician population at any point in the site's occupation. The pottery was identifiably in the tradition of the Iron Age Bantu-speaking cultures of the region. The iron tools were consistent with local production. The architectural features of the stone walls, when examined without the predetermined conclusion that they must be foreign, showed continuity with building traditions present elsewhere in the region. The sequence was local from its earliest layers to its most recent ones, and it showed no interruption, no transition point at which one population had been replaced by another. It showed a single cultural tradition developing across time. Randall McSeaver published his findings in 1906 in a book titled Medieval Rhodesia. His conclusion, stated plainly and without hedging, was that Great Zimbabwe had been built by the Bantu-speaking ancestors of the local African population, and that its date of construction placed it firmly in the medieval period, not in Solomonic antiquity, not in Phoenician prehistory, but in the same broad era that produced the great cathedrals of Europe and the trading cities of the medieval Islamic world. The book was methodologically sound. Its conclusions rested on evidence. Its stratigraphic documentation was precise and reproducible in the sense that any subsequent excavator working in the same deposits would encounter the same sequence. The response from colonial interests was immediate and was not primarily methodological. The attacks on Randall McIver's work did not, in the main, identify errors in his stratigraphic recording, or point to artifacts he had misidentified, or challenge the quality of his excavation technique. They challenged his conclusions on the grounds that those conclusions were unacceptable, that an African civilization could not have built what he was attributing to one, and that his willingness to reach such a conclusion indicated a failure of judgment or an ideological bias that disqualified his findings. The argument was circular in a way that was, and remains, easy to identify. His evidence was dismissed because his conclusion was unacceptable, and his conclusion was unacceptable because his evidence was dismissed. The pattern that Randall Maciever's experience established, rigorous scientific work producing an African origin conclusion, followed by dismissal on grounds that had nothing to do with the scientific work, would repeat itself across the following decades. Each repetition involved different individuals and different specific points of contention, but the underlying structure remained the same. The evidence consistently supported the same conclusion. The colonial response consistently found reasons to reject that conclusion. The reasons shifted over time as each specific objection was answered, but the rejection itself remained stable because the rejection was not based on the evidence. It was based on something the evidence was not capable of touching. In 1929, Gertrude Catton Thompson conducted a systematic excavation at Great Zimbabwe under the auspices of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. She worked with the same careful stratigraphic attention that Randall Maciever had brought to the site more than 2 decades earlier. Recovering from the undisturbed deposits that Hall's earlier destruction had not reached a coherent sequence of Shona pottery, iron tools, clay figurines, and structural remains. The record she produced was consistent with Randall Maciever's findings in every material respect. The deposits were local. The cultural sequence was uninterrupted. There was no foreign stratum, no transition to non-African material culture at any depth she reached. Catton Thompson was direct about what this meant. She stated publicly that examination of all existing evidence could produce not one single item that was not in accordance with Bantu origin and medieval date. The precision of that statement is worth holding. Not one single item. This was not a probabilistic finding, not a conclusion that the balance of evidence favored an African origin while leaving room for alternative interpretations. It was a statement that the evidence examined systematically and in full produced no artifact, no structural feature, no stratigraphic indicator that pointed anywhere other than to the same conclusion Randall Maciever had reached. The scientific record was clear. The scientific record had been clear since 1905. The clarity of the scientific record did not resolve the political question. Colonial Rhodesia was not operating in the domain of scientific conclusions when it maintained its position on Great Zimbabwe. It was operating in the domain of political necessity, and political necessity did not respond to stratigraphic evidence. The government that controlled the territory controlled the official interpretation of the territory's history and an official interpretation of Great Zimbabwe that attributed the ruins to a sophisticated medieval African civilization, was not one that a white minority government could easily accommodate. The ruins were a problem. The scientific evidence about the ruins was a further problem. The solution the colonial administration applied to both was the same one Hall had applied in his excavations: exclusion, suppression, and the removal of inconvenient material from the record. Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence in 1965 changed the political context in a way that made the suppression of Great Zimbabwe's history a matter of explicit state policy rather than an implicit colonial preference. The Rhodesian government that declared its independence from Britain required a historical narrative that supported the legitimacy of white minority rule and the existence of a major medieval African city on the plateau it was claiming to govern, a city that was, by 1965, conclusively established by scientific consensus as the product of the ancestors of the very population the government was subjugating, was a narrative the state was not willing to permit. The suppression that had previously operated through the appointment of men like Hall and the publication of books like his now operated through direct governmental authority over what could be said and what could not. Peter Garlake was an archaeologist working in Rhodesia in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He had conducted serious research at the site and was not willing to endorse the government's required interpretation of Great Zimbabwe's origins. The government's required interpretation was not a scholarly position with which a professional archaeologist might respectfully disagree and then continue working in the country. It was a political mandate, and declining to endorse it had professional and practical consequences that went beyond academic debate. Garlake was effectively forced to leave Rhodesia. His departure, his research files packed, his fieldwork in the country ended, his professional presence in the territory extinguished, was not the result of anything he had found in the ground or published in a journal. It was the result of his refusal to state as true something that was not true, about a stone city whose real history a government had decided it could not afford to acknowledge. His case is worth dwelling on, not because it is unusual in the broad history of colonial intellectual suppression, but because it is so precisely documented. The mechanism is visible. There was a scientific finding. There was a political mandate that contradicted it. There was a professional who refused to allow the political mandate to override the scientific finding, and there was the consequence, removal, the enforced end of a research career in the territory where the research was being conducted. The connection between the political mandate and the professional consequence was not indirect or deniable. It was the explicit operation of a state that had decided to control what its archaeologists were permitted to conclude. What the Rhodesian government could control within its own borders was not, in the end, coextensive with what the scientific record contained. The stratigraphic evidence that Randall McSaver had recorded in 1905 still existed in his published work. Caton Thompson's 1929 findings still existed in hers. The artifacts recovered from undisturbed deposits, the pottery sequences, the iron tools, the evidence of gold working and metal working conducted within the urban settlement, still existed in the collections of institutions where Hall's wheelbarrows had not reached. The evidence that the colonial administration tried most energetically to suppress was the evidence that had survived the colonial administration's earlier physical attempts to destroy it. There is a particular quality to Hall's excavation notes, to the records he kept as he removed those 12 feet of stratified deposit, that is worth attending to. He was methodical. He recorded what he was doing. He described the material he was removing with enough precision that subsequent readers could understand what had been lost. In trying to eliminate the evidence, he produced a document that preserved a partial account of it, a ghost of the stratigraphy he was destroying, visible in negative, in the systematic record of what he took out. The irony is not satisfying in any way that compensates for the loss, but it is instructive about the limits of suppression as a strategy against evidence that has already been partially recorded by the very people conducting the suppression. The artifacts that the Ancient Ruins Company removed from the site in the 1890s, the gold objects, the soapstone carvings, the materials extracted without stratigraphic documentation, went in multiple directions. Some went into private collections, some were sold. Some ended up in institutional holdings in Europe and South Africa. Their removal had destroyed the archaeological context that would have allowed them to be placed precisely within the site's history. but the objects themselves continued to exist. The Zimbabwe bird sculptures, carved from soapstone by craftspeople working within the Zimbabwe kingdom's royal tradition, were among the objects removed from the hill complex during the period of commercial extraction. They were not destroyed, they were relocated. And their continued physical existence in museum collections and storage rooms, far from the plateau where they were carved, would become the subject of ongoing discussions about what it means for an object to be held in a place that is not its origin. Mock cedar-smelling lintel fragment is a small detail in a large archive of misdirection, but it functions as a kind of emblem for how the entire century of denial operated. A material object was examined. The examination produced a subjective impression, the smell of what might have been cedar. That impression was treated as evidence. The evidence was used to support a conclusion that had been reached before any evidence was examined. The entire sequence, from preconception to impression to evidence to conclusion, ran in a single direction, from what was believed toward what would confirm it, and nothing that the material record actually contained was allowed to interrupt the trajectory. What interrupted it, in the end, was not any single dramatic reversal. It was the slow accumulation of carefully recorded observations by people who were willing to let the ground tell them what it contained. Randall McIver in 1905 with his stratigraphic columns, Caton Thompson in 1929 with her systematic sequence of Shona pottery and iron tools, later programs of radiocarbon dating that placed the main construction phase unambiguously in the medieval period. The evidence did not change. What changed, gradually and against significant resistance, was the willingness of the institutional frameworks governing archaeology and history to accept what the evidence had always shown. And the Karanga people and their Shona-speaking descendants had not needed the evidence to be accepted by colonial institutions. They had never needed a European geologist to tell them who had built the walls. Their oral traditions and their cultural memory and their continuous inhabitation of the landscape around the ruins had carried that knowledge through the centuries of colonial misattribution without requiring external validation. But the scientific record mattered in a different way. It mattered because it existed in a form that the institutions which had claimed authority over the site's interpretation could not permanently dismiss, and because its accumulation made the maintenance of the colonial position increasingly costly and eventually untenable. The cost of maintaining the colonial position was not only institutional, it was also documentary. Every year that the Rhodesian government required archaeologists to reach predetermined conclusions about Great Zimbabwe was a year in which the paper trail of that requirement accumulated. Every professional who was pressured or who left or who was prevented from publishing accurate findings left behind a record of what had happened to them and why. The archive of suppression was building at the same time as the archive of evidence, and the two archives together told a story about the century of denial that is now fully legible to anyone who examines the documentary record. Randall McIver's stratigraphic columns from 1905 are not a dramatic document. They are methodical and precise and quiet, organized as the field notes of a careful excavation are organized, recording the fine locations and cultural attributions and observable characteristics of objects recovered from a series of stratified layers. They do not argue, they record. Layer by layer, they set down what the ground at Great Zimbabwe contained when it was examined by someone who was not trying to make it contain something else, and what they show in their quiet columns of observation as a continuous record of African material culture, from the earliest accessible deposits to the most recent, no gap, no transition, No foreign stratum, nothing that points anywhere other than to the conclusion that had been politically inconvenient since the moment Randall McSeaver first stated it. The field notes sat in an archive after publication, accumulating the patient company of subsequent work that kept reaching the same findings. Cotton Thompson's notes joined them. The radiocarbon dating results joined them. The faunal analysis reports and the botanical remains studies and the iron slag assessments joined them. The archive grew, and what the archive contained did not change in its essential finding, because the essential finding was supported by the ground itself, and the ground had not been altered by the political needs of the governments that wanted its history to read differently. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe remained where they had always been through all of this. The great enclosure's walls still standing, the conical tower still sealed, the hill complex still rising above the valley floor on its granite boulders. The stone did not record the century of denial. The stone recorded only its own construction, the precision of its courses, the weight of its individual blocks stacked without mortar across 7 centuries. The arguments about who had built it moved through the air above it and left no mark on it. Whatever the colonial administrators decided it meant, and whatever the colonial archaeologists were required to conclude, and whatever the official guides were instructed to tell the visitors who came to see it, the wall at the base of the great enclosure remained exactly what it had always been. Granite blocks split from nearby kopjes along their natural fault lines, laid by hands that knew what they were doing, in courses so precisely interlocked that no gap wide enough for a finger runs between them. That is the physical fact that survives the century of denial most completely, not the field notes, though the field notes survive, not the published conclusions, though the published conclusions survive. The wall itself, the weight and the grain and the interlocking courses of it, had been saying the same thing since the 14th century, and saying it in a language that could not be suppressed or retracted or required to reach a different conclusion. The wall said, someone built this. The wall said, it took skill and organization and accumulated knowledge across generations. The wall said nothing about who that someone was, because the wall did not need to, because the stratigraphic record had already said it in Randall McSeaver's careful columns. In the undisturbed pottery sequences that Catton Thompson recorded, in the radiocarbon dates that would follow later, layer after patient layer, each one pointing in the same direction as all the others. The question the political record does not fully answer is what it cost the people whose history was being misattributed to them, not in terms of the archaeological record, which can be measured in feet of destroyed stratigraphy and in the lost find contexts of removed artifacts, but in the daily experience of living in proximity to a monument that the governing system insisted had nothing to do with them, that their ancestors had not built, that their oral traditions were wrong about, that the stone walls in the valley below them and the plateau spreading in every direction constituted a past to which they had no claim. That experience is not fully captured in the archaeological archive. It exists elsewhere, in the memories of the people who lived through it and in the communities that carried the knowledge forward, regardless of what the colonial administration required them to say about it. The silence of the ruins through all of this is not an absence. It is the particular stillness of something that has been waiting without urgency, because what it is made of is not susceptible to urgency, and what it contains has already been said in the only language it speaks, which is the language of stone and soil and the accumulated layers of a long habitation. Randall McIver's columns are in an archive somewhere. The undisturbed deposits he recorded, layer after layer of exclusively African material culture, Pottery and iron and charcoal and the physical residue of centuries of organized life are documented in those columns with the quiet precision of someone who had let the evidence say what it needed to say and had then written it down. The political infrastructure that required those conclusions to be rejected has since been dismantled. The scientific consensus that those columns helped establish has not changed in its fundamental finding since 1906, and the stratigraphic record itself, as far as it survived Hall's wheelbarrows, still exists in what was not destroyed, in the portions of the site that were not reached, in the collections that were documented before they were moved, in the notes of every careful excavator who worked at Great Zimbabwe and wrote down what the ground contained. The field notes from 1905 said everything that needed to be said about who built Great Zimbabwe. The document existed. The evidence it recorded existed. The conclusion it supported existed. It took decades and required the work of multiple excavators, the accumulation of radiocarbon dating programs, and the eventual collapse of the political system that had most actively required the conclusion to be suppressed, before the institutions with authority over the site's official interpretation were willing to align themselves with what the ground had been saying all along. The ground had not been waiting for them. The ground does not wait in any sense that involves impatience or urgency. The ground simply held what it held, and the stone walls stood where they stood, and Randall McIver's columns sat in the archive with the particular stillness of evidence that has already done its work and requires nothing further from the arguments still being conducted above it. A laboratory result does not look like history. It looks like columns. Sample numbers running down the left margin, calibrated date ranges printed in a narrow font beside them, standard deviations expressed as plus or minus figures, so small they seem almost apologetic about the precision they represent. The paper is unremarkable. The numbers sit quietly on it, doing nothing more than existing, indifferent to what they overturn or confirm, and what the columns from the independent radiocarbon dating programs conducted at Great Zimbabwe confirm. Across multiple programs run across the better part of a century, is a date range of approximately 1000 CE to 1450 CE for the main phase of stone construction and intensive urban occupation at the site. The charcoal from which those dates were extracted came from stratified deposits within the walls and enclosures. The chemistry of its decay did not know it was settling a question. It simply gave back what it had held, and the numbers said what the numbers said. The significance of that date range is not visible in the figures themselves. It requires a short calculation to feel it. Any theory proposing that the walls of Great Zimbabwe were built by Phoenicians, by ancient Israelites, by seafarers from the pre-Christian Mediterranean world, would require that construction to have occurred at least 1,000 years before the radiocarbon record places it, not a century earlier, not 2 centuries, 1,000 years. The proposed builders would have needed to arrive, construct a city of nearly 1 million granite blocks across a plateau in the African interior, and then disappear without leaving a single datable object, a single inscription, a single tool or coin, or ceramic fragment traceable to any culture other than the Karenga people of the Zimbabwe plateau. The record does not show that. The record shows with the quiet consistency of independently repeated chemistry that the city was built when it was built, by the people who were there when it was built, and that no other account of its origins survives contact with the dates printed in those columns. Multiple programs reached the same result. That repetition matters in a way that single studies cannot. The first program produced a date range consistent with medieval African occupation. Subsequent programs, using additional samples from different locations within the site, produced date ranges consistent with the first. The cumulative record across all of them describes a construction sequence and occupation period that aligns precisely with what archaeologists working from the material culture, the pottery, the iron tools, the architectural sequence had already concluded from the artifacts themselves. The chemistry and the artifacts told the same story. They told it independently. The agreement between them is the scientific record of Great Zimbabwe as it now stands, and that record is not contested in any peer-reviewed venue by any researcher working from primary evidence. Gertrude Catton Thompson arrived at Great Zimbabwe in 1929 under the auspices of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, carrying excavation equipment and a systematic methodology that distinguished her work from what had preceded it at the site. She was not the first rigorous archaeologist to work there, but the deposits she found were in some places still undisturbed, and the stratigraphic sequence she recovered from them was coherent in a way that the earlier destruction of stratified material had made seem, to some, newly impossible. Her field notes from that season record, layer by layer, what the undisturbed deposits contained. Pottery, iron tools, clay figurines, each layer cataloged by type and position, each object placed in its stratigraphic context and recorded in the handwritten columns she kept through the excavation. The sequence was consistent across the undisturbed areas she examined. None of it pointed outside the cultural tradition of the Shona-speaking people of southern Africa. None of it carried any trace of Mediterranean, Arabian, or Semitic origin. Her published conclusion was stated without qualification. Examination of all existing evidence, she wrote, could produce not one single item that was not in accordance with Bantu origin and medieval date. The sentence is careful and total, not one single item. It does not say the evidence is ambiguous or that it leans toward African origin while leaving room for other interpretations. It says the evidence, read in its entirety, produces no result inconsistent with what the Shona-speaking ancestors of the modern Zimbabwean population had been identified as. The builders of this city, on this plateau, in this period. That sentence was not welcome in the Rhodesian colonial context of 1929. It did not change that context, but it entered the record, where it remained, and where it remains now, in the same relationship to the evidence it always occupied, accurate, documented, and undisturbed by subsequent excavation. The field notes she kept are the more intimate document. A published conclusion travels, gets cited, gets challenged in the political register of the colonial period. Field notes stay in their archive. They sit in their folders with the same handwritten columns Catton Thompson filled in during the 1929 season, recording layer after layer of Shona pottery, iron objects, and structural remains from deposits that had survived the earlier clearing of the site. Layer, type, description, position, the record of a city's material life preserved in sediment and then read back out of it by someone trained to read it without deciding in advance what it should say. Those notes are still there. The conclusion that can be drawn from them has not changed since she drew it. What the faunal remains from the midden deposits at Great Zimbabwe describe is an economy that centered on cattle in a way that was not merely practical. The most commonly consumed large mammal across the excavated midden layers was cattle, by a margin that places every other species at a considerable distance. The cut marks and fragmentation patterns on the recovered bone establish that cattle were slaughtered and consumed at the site in quantities consistent with the feeding of a substantial population over an extended period of time. But within that large assemblage of cattle bone, the tooth wear patterns on some of the recovered teeth indicate that certain animals were kept alive to advanced ages, past the point where they would have been most efficient as sources of meat. Animals kept that long were kept for milk. They were kept for labor. They were kept because their continued living value exceeded their value as a single meal, and because a society organized around cattle wealth understood the difference between consuming an asset and holding it. The charred botanical remains from the same midden deposits and from floor surfaces within the enclosures identify sorghum and millet as the dominant staple crops. The charring that preserved them was incidental, grains that fell into cooking fires, seeds that were near a structure when it burned, organic material that would otherwise have decomposed entirely in the centuries since it was deposited. What survived did so by accident and was recovered by method. The dietary profile these remains describe is consistent with later Shona agricultural traditions documented in historical and ethnographic sources. The food that sustained the city was the food that sustained the civilization that preceded it and the civilization that followed it. The continuity is not coincidental. It is the continuity of a people in a landscape they had cultivated and adapted to across many generations, whose agricultural knowledge was part of the same inheritance as the stone-cutting technique and the political organization that built the walls. Taken together, the faunal and botanical evidence from Great Zimbabwe presents something that is easy to underestimate, a complete picture of ordinary life. Not the extraordinary life of a trading empire, or a royal court, or a religious center, though the city was all of those things. The ordinary life of grain being ground and cattle being milked, and some animals being slaughtered for a feast, while others were walked out to pasture for another season's work. The residue of that life is in the midden layers, in the charred seeds on the floor surfaces, in the dental wear patterns of cattle that grew old inside an economy that found a use for them as long as they lived. That residue is not symbolic. It does not require interpretation in terms of anything outside itself. It is simply what people left behind when they lived and ate and organized their days in a place, and it is there in the ground, and it has been recovered, and it says what it says about who those people were and how they sustained themselves. The metalworking evidence at Great Zimbabwe is held partly in objects and partly in the physical remnants of the processes that made them. Iron slag deposits were recovered from within and immediately adjacent to the urban settlement, the cooled waste material produced when iron ore was reduced in a furnace, discarded after the useful metal was extracted. Alongside the slag, excavations recovered tuyeres, ceramic nozzles used to direct the forced air from bellows into a smelting furnace, increasing the temperature inside it to the point where reduction became possible. The tuyeres recovered from Great Zimbabwe bear on their clay surfaces the glassy vitrified finish left by repeated exposure to furnace temperatures sufficient for iron smelting. They are small objects. They sit in the collections of the site museum now, each one carrying on its surface the heat signatures of a process that was carried out somewhere nearby, by hands that understood exactly what temperature was required and how long the bellows needed to run. The crucible fragments showing gold residues are a different category of evidence. A crucible is used not for smelting, which extracts metal from ore, but for working metal that has already been extracted, melting and refining, and casting it into new forms. The gold residues on the crucible fragments from Great Zimbabwe confirm that gold processing was not merely passing through the city on its way from mine to coast. It was happening inside the walls. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe were not simply intermediaries who taxed the passage of gold through their territory. They exercised direct control over its production at the source, and its processing into refined and finished forms before it entered the trade network. The small gold objects recovered from excavations, wire, beads, thin sheet metal, are the surviving products of that processing. Each one is a finished piece of a larger economy, a small bright object that moved from the greenstone reefs of the plateau into a furnace and then into whatever form a craftsperson decided it should take, before it moved again into the trade routes that connected this plateau to the Indian Ocean world. The site museum near the great enclosure holds several of the Zimbabwe bird sculptures in display cases with interpretive text, identifying them as dynastic emblems of the Mambo's royal ancestors. The soapstone from which they were carved comes from the Zimbabwe plateau. The form each bird takes, upright, alert, perched on a stone column, its beak closed, its features worn at the edges by centuries of exposure before the sculptures were removed from their original positions, was given to it by a Karanga craftsperson working within a tradition of meaning that connected the royal lineage to the spiritual authority of the ancestral world. The birds that remain at the site stand in their cases as the objects they always were, carved emblems of a specific political and spiritual order, made on the plateau where that order was centered, by people who understood what the carving meant, in a way that no subsequent interpretation has fully recovered. The interpretive text in the museum does its best. The birds themselves offer nothing beyond their form, which is enough. The UNESCO inscription of Great Zimbabwe on the World Heritage List in 1986 came with documentation that explicitly attributed the site to the Shona-speaking ancestors of the modern Zimbabwean people. That attribution is not a diplomatic formality. It reflects the scientific consensus that had been building across the 20th century through the accumulation of radiocarbon dates, stratigraphic sequences, material culture analyses, and faunal and botanical studies, all of which pointed in the same direction. The inscription formalized, at the level of an internationally recognized designation, what the evidence had been establishing since Randall McSiver's careful field notes from 1905. The city was built by the people whose descendants still inhabit the landscape around it. That is not a contested claim. It is the scientific and historical consensus of the field, inscribed in the record of an international body, grounded in the cumulative weight of evidence recovered across a century of increasingly rigorous excavation. What the inscription did not resolve, what remains unresolved in the records of diplomatic correspondence and legal discussions between Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Germany, is the full repatriation of the Zimbabwe bird sculptures removed from the site during the colonial period. Not all 6 of the birds removed during that period have been returned. Several remain the subject of ongoing discussions that have accumulated over years without reaching a final disposition. The birds are not lost. Their locations are known. They exist in collections and museum storage rooms in buildings on other continents, each one a carved soapstone object made on the Zimbabwe plateau in the medieval period and removed from the site by processes that formed part of the broader colonial disruption of the site's integrity. The diplomatic correspondence about their return continues. The legal frameworks within which repatriation discussions take place are complex in ways that do not resolve quickly. The birds wait in the particular way that objects wait, without impatience, without awareness of what is being negotiated on their behalf, simply continuing to exist in whatever room currently holds them. There are questions about Great Zimbabwe that the scientific record has answered fully. The date of construction answered. The identity of the builders answered. The nature of the economy that sustained the city answered through the faunal remains, the botanical evidence, the metalworking residues, the the trade goods recovered from stratified excavation layers, the relationship between the site and the broader Indian Ocean world economy, established through the porcelain fragments, the glassware, the documented connections between the plateau's gold production and the coastal trading cities of the Swahili coast. These are not open questions. They were answered by chemistry and by method and by the accumulation of evidence across a century of increasingly careful work, and the answers are in the published literature and in the archive, and they do not require revisiting. There are other questions that remain genuinely open. The precise function of the conical tower inside the great enclosure, solid, sealed, containing no interior, offering no entrance, has been interpreted as a ceremonial symbol of royal authority over agricultural abundance, but that interpretation rests on analogy and inference rather than on a document or inscription that states what the tower meant to those who built it. The full social and ceremonial organization of the hill complex during the city's peak period is reconstructed from artifact distributions, structural analysis, and comparison with later Shona political traditions, but the specific protocols and rituals of the Mambo's court are not recoverable in detail from the physical record. The precise mechanism of the city's decline, the relative weight of shifting trade routes, ecological strain, and political reorganization in the northward movement toward the Zambezi is understood in outline but debated in its specific proportions. These are not failures of the science. They are the ordinary limits of what material evidence can establish about a city that left no written texts, whose oral traditions were disrupted by colonial processes, and whose stratified deposits were partially destroyed before systematic excavation began. The questions that remain open about Great Zimbabwe are the kind that make a site live in the scholarly imagination rather than settle into a closed file. They are not gaps that suggest mystery in the conspiratorial sense, not absences that point toward suppressed truth, or hidden builders, or alternative histories waiting to be recovered. They are gaps of the kind that all archaeological sites produce, where the material record preserves certain categories of evidence reliably and lets others dissolve into soil, where the physical reality of a city survives in its stones and its middens, while the texture of its daily life, its ceremonies, its political arguments, its private conversations, disappear without remainder. The gaps are honest. They are what the record looks like at the edge of what chemistry and stratigraphy and comparative analysis can reach. A tuyere from the site museum carries the heat of a furnace that was running somewhere in or near the great enclosure in the 14th century. The glassy surface on its clay is a physical record of a temperature, and that temperature is a physical record of an industry, and that industry is part of the explanation for why Ibn Battuta, visiting Kilwakasiwani in 1330, found a city made wealthy by gold that arrived from the interior. The chain of physical evidence connecting a vitrified piece of ceramic in a museum case to the description of a coastal city in a medieval travel account is long, and it runs through real objects at every link. The tuyere is real. The gold residues on the crucible fragments are real. The Song Dynasty celadon, recovered from stratified deposits at the site, is real. Ibn Battuta's account of Kilwa is real. The connection between them is not an interpretation imposed on the evidence. It is what the evidence produces when it is read carefully and followed where it goes. The radiocarbon results, the stratigraphic field notes, the faunal analyses, the botanical studies, the metalworking residues, all of this documentation exists in the same institutional space as the Zimbabwe birds that have not yet come home. Files accumulate in archives in Harare and Pretoria and Berlin, Laboratory reports sit in university collections. Field notes from excavation seasons conducted across the 20th century are stored in the institutions that sponsored the work. The birds themselves sit in display cases or storage rooms, their carved soapstone surfaces unchanged since they were made on the plateau 7 centuries ago, indifferent to the correspondence accumulating around the question of where they belong. The site itself is still there. The outer wall of the great enclosure still stands to 11 meters in its best preserved sections, its granite courses interlocked without mortar in the same configuration they occupied when the last block was placed. The conical tower inside still rises 9 meters, still sealed, still solid through its entire height, still offering no entrance. The hill complex still sits 80 meters above the valley floor on its granite boulder formation, the sockets where the soapstone columns once stood still, visible in the rock surface where they were anchored. The valley ruins still extend across a broad landscape of enclosures, whose walls vary in height and finish in the same way they always did, marking in stone the social gradations of a city that organized itself by proximity and quality of construction. The site has been here continuously since the 14th century. The stones have not moved. The question of who put them there was never actually lost, even in the decades when official positions required a different answer. What changes over the long arc of the scientific record is not the site. The site remains. What changes is the accumulation of evidence around it, the growing precision of the dates, the more complete recovery of the faunal and botanical record, the fuller analysis of the trade goods and the metalworking residues, the more careful documentation of what survives and what was lost in the earlier clearing of deposits. The record grows. The consensus it supports has been stable for the better part of a century, and the additional work done since Catton Thompson's 1929 excavation has only deepened and extended it, filling in the details of a city that was already clearly identified in outline by the time the radiocarbon dating programs began producing their columns of figures. There is something particular about the way a radiocarbon date is produced that stays with the mind once it is understood. A piece of charcoal is recovered from a stratified deposit. It is recorded in its stratigraphic context, its position in the sequence of layers above and below it noted. It is removed and submitted to a laboratory where the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 remaining in the sample is measured with precision instruments. That ratio decays at a known rate. The amount of decay present in the sample establishes, within a calculable margin of error, how long ago the carbon in the charcoal stopped exchanging with the atmosphere, which is to say, how long ago the wood that became charcoal was alive. The result is printed as a calibrated date range with a standard deviation. It is placed in a column with other results from other samples. The column says what it says, and what it says about Great Zimbabwe is that the charcoal in those stratified deposits stopped exchanging carbon with the atmosphere between approximately 1000 and 1450 CE, depending on the sample and its position in the sequence. The charcoal was once wood. The wood was once a tree growing on the Zimbabwe plateau in the medieval period. The tree was cut, used, burned. The charcoal from that burning was deposited in the earth within or near the walls of a city that was alive when the tree was alive. The tree and the city were contemporaries. The chemistry of the charcoal confirms it. There is no gap in that chain of evidence, no point at which an alternative reading can be inserted. The city that left the charcoal in the ground was the city that was there when the wood was burned, and the wood was burned in the medieval period, and the people who burned it were the people who lived in the city at that time, and the people who lived in the city at that time were the Karanga ancestors of the Shona-speaking population of the Zimbabwe Plateau. The science does not require that this conclusion be received as surprising or vindicating. It simply is what the evidence shows. It was always what the evidence showed. The systematic excavation programs of the 20th century did not discover a new truth about Great Zimbabwe, so much as they documented, with increasing precision and replicability, a truth that had never ceased to be visible in the stones themselves, in the pottery, in the architectural sequence, in the cultural continuity between the city's builders and the population that has always surrounded the site. The science formalized what the record had always contained. In a storage room in a building that is not on the Zimbabwe Plateau, one of the Zimbabwe bird sculptures that has not yet been repatriated sits in whatever condition its current institution maintains it. The soapstone is the same soapstone it has always been, the gray-green stone of the Zimbabwe Plateau, carved into a form that expressed in the political and spiritual language of the Karanga court the connection between the living Mambo and the royal ancestors who continued to govern the welfare of the land through their presence in the spirit world. The carving was done carefully. The features of the bird are worn at the edges now, as stone wears over centuries of exposure and handling, but the form is still legible. It is still recognizably what it was made to be. The diplomatic process that governs the question of this bird's return moves at the pace diplomatic processes move. There are frameworks for the discussion. There are claims under various legal and institutional arrangements. There are positions held by the institutions currently housing the sculptures, and positions held by the Zimbabwean government, and positions held by the international bodies whose guidelines shape these negotiations. Correspondence accumulates. Meetings are convened, and their outcomes are recorded in documents that are added to files that grow alongside the correspondence. The process continues. It has been continuing for years. It has not yet produced a final result for all of the birds that were removed. The bird in the storage room does not know any of this. It exists in the particular way that carved stone exists, completely, without awareness of the question being asked about it, without impatience for an answer. Its soapstone surface is the same surface that was worked by a craftsperson on the Zimbabwe Plateau 7 centuries ago in a workshop somewhere within or near the walls of a city that was then at or near the height of its political and economic life. The person who carved it was working within a tradition of meaning that connected the physical form of the bird to the spiritual authority of the Mambo's royal lineage. That meaning was embedded in the carving, not as a hidden code, but as a straightforward expression of what the sculpture was for. It stood on its column above the granite boulders of the hill complex. It looked out over the valley ruins spread across the plateau below. It was part of the visual language of a royal center that organized political, spiritual, and economic authority in a single place and expressed that authority in stone. The valley below the hill complex is still there. The stone walls that organized its social space are still there, in varying states of preservation, their doorways still standing in some places, their interiors open to the same sky they were open to when the enclosures were inhabited. The 720 hectares that the city once covered have not shrunk.